I found my best friend's name, saved as dentist in my husband's phone. What those messages revealed destroyed 2 marriages the same week. It took me 6 years of marriage to learn one simple rule. If your husband suddenly starts putting a password on his phone for work security, it was never about work. My name is Emma. I'm 29 years old. And 3 weeks ago, I was sitting on my bathroom floor at 2 in the morning, scrolling through a conversation with a contact saved in my husband's phone as dentist. Well, here's the problem. I know our actual dentist personally. His name is Dr. Harris. He's 62 years old, and he definitely does not text "missed you today" at 1 in the morning. But before I get to the bathroom floor, you need to understand exactly how long I'd been blind to what was happening right in front of me. Because trust me, by the end of this story, you're going to want to scream at me the same way I now scream at myself. And stick with me because the twist near the middle of this story is something none of my friends saw coming either. Not even the ones who suspected something was wrong for months before I did. Jason and I got married when I was 23. He's 5 years older than me, works as a project manager for a construction firm, makes good money, never drank too much, never raised his voice at me. My mother adored him more than she adored me. She used to joke that if we ever got divorced, she'd keep him and send me packing. The first 4 years of our marriage were honestly just normal. Not a fairy tale, but stable. We had a plan. Pay off the house first, then start trying for a baby. We had mutual friends, a predictable rhythm, a life that looked from the outside exactly like the life I always thought I wanted. Every July, we'd take a trip with our best friends, Mark and Caitlin. Caitlin was my person. We met freshman year of college, both of us crying in a dorm hallway over a failed chemistry exam. And from that ridiculous moment on, we were inseparable. She was my maid of honor. I held her hand in the hospital when she gave birth to her first son. We texted every single day, recipes, memes, husband complaints, dressing room selfies. 11 years of friendship. 11 years I thought meant something. Oh, if you've already guessed where this story is going, slow down because it gets so much worse than you think. And there's a second betrayal buried in here that I didn't see coming until almost the very end, so don't get comfortable yet. About a year before that night on the bathroom floor, Jason started staying late at work more often. At first, it was small stuff. The project's on fire. I have to finish this presentation. New regional manager wants weekly reports now. Nothing alarming. He'd always had busy stretches before, and I was used to him walking in around 9 or 10 some nights. But then smaller, stranger details started to pile up. He started showering the second he walked through the door before dinner, when for 6 years he'd always eaten first and showered right before bed. He started laying his phone face down on the counter, something he'd literally never done before. But he used to leave it lying around, screen up, notifications visible, completely careless. And there was a new cologne that would appear in our bathroom for a week and then vanish. A scent I never once saw him actually wear in front of me. Any one of those details on its own means nothing. Together, over a full year, they built a picture I spent 12 months subconsciously refusing to look at directly. My younger sister, Liza, visited us for a weekend around that time. And over dinner, she just said it flat out. "Emma, does it feel like Jason's been kind of distant lately?" I told her he was just going through a rough patch at work. She didn't bring it up again, but I remember the way she looked at me afterward. The exact look you give someone who is lying to themselves and you both know it. Here's the part that still makes my hands shake a little when I think about it. 2 months after that conversation with my sister, I actually caught a glimpse of something on Jason's phone screen, just a notification preview, gone in a second, and I made myself forget it on purpose. I want you to remember that detail because it becomes important again later in this story, in a way I never expected. Before I get to the bathroom floor, there's one more piece of the timeline I have to tell you about, because when I look back now, it's almost painful how obvious it was. About 4 months before everything came out, we threw a joint birthday party for me and Caitlin. Our birthdays are 11 days apart, and we'd celebrated together every year since college. Jason was in charge of the playlist that year, which was normal. He always handled music at our parties. But at some point during the night, I noticed he'd added 3 songs that meant nothing to me at all. Songs I'd never heard him play before. Songs that felt oddly specific and sentimental for a casual backyard party. I actually asked him about it. I remember the exact moment. We were both a little tipsy, standing near the cooler, and I said, "Since when do you like this song?" He laughed it off and said something about hearing it in a coffee shop and getting it stuck in his head. I believed him instantly because why wouldn't I? Months later on that bathroom floor, I found those exact 3 songs mentioned by name in the messages between him and Caitlin. Songs they'd apparently made into their songs months before that party. He had played their songs at our shared birthday party in front of both of us, in front of Mark, in front of my entire family, and none of us heard it for what it actually was. I bring this up because if you've ever had a strange, tiny feeling about a detail that made no sense, a song, a receipt, a changed routine, and talked yourself out of it because the alternative felt too big to consider. I want you to know you're not paranoid. Sometimes your gut collects evidence long before your brain is ready to look at it directly. Mine did, for months. And I ignored every single signal until I physically couldn't anymore. That night, I wasn't looking for anything. Jason had fallen asleep on the couch with the TV still on, and I went to bed, and I noticed he'd left his phone on the kitchen counter, unlocked, mid-update on some app. I want to be clear, I am not someone who checks her husband's phone. In 6 years of marriage, I never once read his messages. But that night, a notification popped up on the screen by itself, short and quiet, from a contact saved as dentist. Same time tomorrow, 7 p.m., as always. Missed you today. I froze completely. Our actual dentist, Dr. Harris, was not texting like that. And he certainly wasn't meeting Jason same time as always at 7 in the evening, every week, while Jason's official story was that he was stuck late at the office. I picked up the phone, walked into the bathroom, locked the door, and sat down on the tile floor. My hands were shaking so badly I mistyped the passcode twice. Thank God it hadn't fully locked yet. What I found in the next 20 minutes changed my entire life, and what I found 3 weeks later changed it again, in a way that made the first discovery feel almost small by comparison. But we'll get there. Dentist was not some stranger from a dating app, not an old coworker, not a random woman from the gym. It was Caitlin, my best friend of 11 years, and of the maid of honor at my wedding, the godmother we'd already picked out for the baby Jason and I were planning to have. The conversation stretched back almost 8 months. I'm not going to walk you through every single line, but here's what mattered. This wasn't a one-time slip. This was hotel rooms once a week disguised as yoga with the girls on her end and stuck at the office on his. There were photos I don't need to describe. There were conversations about what to do about Mark and me, about when the right time would be, the right time. Like my husband and my best friend's husband were a logistics problem to be solved on a convenient afternoon, not two actual people they were lying to every single day. The worst part wasn't even the affair itself. It was how casual the messages were. No guilt in the texts, jokes, plans for their next hotel date the same way you'd plan picking up dry cleaning. I sat on that bathroom floor for almost an hour. Just scrolling backward through 8 months of my life, I thought I understood. And somewhere around message 400, I found something that made the betrayal so much bigger than just an affair. Something I am going to tell you about later, because if I dump it on you right now, you won't believe the timeline. And the timeline is the whole point. Before I move on to the night I didn't sleep, there's one specific message thread I have to tell you about, because it's the moment the entire affair stopped feeling like a betrayal I could compartmentalize and started feeling like something that had quietly rewritten years of my life without my permission. Buried in the conversation, dated almost exactly 1 year before I found any of it, was a photo. Not the kind you're probably imagining. This one was a screenshot of a calendar. My calendar, actually, a shared planning app Jason and I used for scheduling things like doctor's appointments and family events. Caitlin had sent it to him with a caption about knowing exactly when not to text her, referencing a week I had blocked off for a work conference out of town. That single screenshot told me 2 things I wasn't prepared for. First, that Jason had shown Caitlin private details from our shared calendar, things that had nothing to do with her, purely so the two of them could plan around my schedule more efficiently. Second, and this one hit harder, that this had clearly been going on long enough and had clearly felt safe enough to both of them, that they were coordinating logistics with the same casual efficiency you'd use for a carpool. I sat there on that bathroom floor, holding onto the edge of the bathtub, because for a moment I genuinely thought I might be sick. It's one thing to imagine a betrayal as something that happens in stolen, chaotic moments. It's another thing entirely to realize it had become organized, routine, efficient, a second relationship running quietly underneath my actual one, with its own inside jokes and its own shared calendar logic, built out of pieces of my own life. I didn't wake Jason up and scream. I know a lot of people would have. Something in me, maybe the same instinct that had spent a full year ignoring warning signs, told me to wait. I forwarded every screenshot to my own email. All 800 plus messages, the photos, the dates, everything, backed up in 3 different places before I even stood up off that bathroom floor. Then I put the phone back exactly where it had been, turned off the light, and lay down next to a man who had spent that entire evening cuddling me on the couch during a movie, knowing full well what I now knew. I didn't sleep for 1 single minute. I lay there thinking about Caitlin's wedding, where I'd stood beside her as her maid of honor 2 years earlier. I thought about holding her hand in the delivery room. I thought about every single time I'd complained to her about a small fight with Jason, and she'd sat there giving me advice, knowing exactly what she was doing behind my back the entire time. And somewhere around 4 in the morning, I remembered something, a detail from months earlier that I'd buried without realizing it mattered. I'm going to tell you what that detail was in a few minutes, but I need you to sit with the fact that betrayal number one wasn't even the whole story, not even close. The next morning, I acted completely normal. I made Jason coffee. I kissed him goodbye. He had no idea. I called into work and took 2 days off sick. Instead, I drove to see Caitlin's older sister, Amanda, someone I'd always been close with in her own right. I showed her the screenshots. She went pale and admitted she'd suspected something for months, but didn't want to be the one to blow up my life. Before I tell you about the plan I built over those 2 days, there's something else I have to mention because it's the part of this story that made me question not just my marriage, but almost every close relationship I had at the time. Scrolling further back through those messages that first night, I found a conversation from 10 months earlier, even before the affair with Caitlin technically started, between Jason and a coworker of his named Priya. It wasn't romantic. It was worse in a different way. It was Jason telling Priya in detail that things with me had been boring for a while and that he didn't know how much longer he could keep pretending everything was fine. Priya, to her credit, actually told him he should either fix his marriage or be honest with me, and he brushed her off completely. I found that conversation and felt something strange happen in my chest. Not just betrayal over the affair anymore, but a kind of retroactive grief for a marriage I thought was simply ordinary, when apparently my husband had been quietly narrating its death to a coworker for the better part of a year before he ever touched Caitlin. I want to be honest with you. This detail almost broke me more than the affair itself. An affair, as awful as it is, can sometimes happen impulsively, in a moment of weakness. This was different. This was a year of him deciding, over and over, not to talk to me, and talking to everyone else instead. Then I went to see a lawyer. Not because I was ready to file for divorce that same day, but because I needed to understand my rights before Jason knew anything was wrong. My lawyer told me to document everything, to move half of our joint savings into a separate account, which was completely legal and completely reasonable, not revenge, no matter what Jason tried to call it later, and not to confront him at home, alone, where he could spin the story before anyone else heard the truth. I picked a Sunday, family dinner at my parents' house where Jason would be there. And this is the detail that made the whole thing so much bigger than a simple affair. Mark and Caitlin would be there too, because my mom had invited them a month earlier, the way she always did, since our two families had spent every Sunday together for years. I didn't plan the confrontation like some kind of performance. I just knew that if I told Jason alone, he'd find a way to twist it into, it's not what it looks like. Let me explain. The same script cheaters have been running for as long as cheating has existed. I needed witnesses. And I needed Mark to hear the truth at the exact same moment I did. Not weeks later, through a filtered, softened version of events. Halfway through dinner, during a lull in the conversation, I just said, I have something I want to show everyone. I handed my phone to my mother. The screenshot album was already open. She started scrolling, and I watched every trace of color drain out of her face in real time. Mark didn't understand what was happening at first. Then he saw his wife's name under photos, time-stamped from the week before, and he stood up so fast his chair crashed backward onto the floor. He didn't yell. He just walked out, got in his car, and left without saying a single word to anyone. Caitlin started crying almost immediately. The second she realized I already knew everything, not because she felt guilty for what she'd done to me, because she'd been caught. That distinction, the difference between those two things, was the final piece of proof I needed about exactly who she really was. Underneath 11 years of friendship, I thought I understood. Jason tried to keep his voice low, like that could somehow save him. Emma, not in front of everyone. Let's talk about this at home. I told him we were done talking privately. I'd spent 8 months listening in silence without even knowing it. Now it was his turn. Here's a part of the story most people ask me about later, so let me get ahead of it now. Mark didn't just disappear that Sunday and never come back into the picture. His story became tangled up with mine in a way neither of us expected. Over the following weeks, as both of our marriages were collapsing at the same time, Mark and I ended up talking almost every day, not out of anything romantic, but because we were the only two people on Earth who understood exactly what the other one was going through, betrayed by the same two people on the same timeline in the same lies. He told me things I hadn't known, small details from his side that lined up with mine in ways that made the whole picture even worse. Caitlin had told him she was taking extra yoga classes to process some anxiety. Jason had told me he was mentoring a junior employee after hours. 2 lies built to protect the same 8 months. Mark took the kids and moved in with his brother. Caitlin stayed in their house alone, and this part still catches people off guard when I tell it. She and Jason didn't even end up staying together after everything came out. Turns out someone who can lie for 8 straight months to both her husband and her best friend at the same time isn't exactly a stable foundation for anyone's next relationship either. I mentioned earlier that my mother adored Jason, maybe more than she adored me, and I need to circle back to that because her reaction after that Sunday dinner is one of the parts of this story people bring up to me most often. For the first week, she barely spoke to me. Not because she blamed me, she made that clear immediately, but because she was genuinely, completely blindsided, the same way I had been. She'd known Jason for 6 years. She'd taken his side in small arguments before, teased me about being too sensitive once or twice when I'd vented to her about him. I think, honestly, some part of her felt guilty for not seeing it either, and she processed that guilt by going quiet for a while. Then, about 10 days after the dinner, she showed up at my sister's apartment unannounced with a suitcase full of my childhood things she'd apparently been saving in her attic, photos, an old journal, a blanket I'd had since I was 6, and she just said, "I should have asked you more questions a year ago. I'm sorry I didn't." We cried in my sister's kitchen for almost an hour. It's one of the only good memories I have from that entire period, and I hold on to it carefully. My father, for what it's worth, handled it very differently. He didn't say much at all. He just quietly, without ever discussing it with me directly, made sure Jason was never invited to another family event again, ever, for any reason. And nobody in my family has questioned that decision once in 2 years. I'm not going to pretend the months after that dinner were anything other than brutal. For 3 months, I lived with my sister. Jason texted me every single day, excuses first, then anger, then apologies, then excuses again, cycling through the same 4 stages like a script he couldn't stop running. I blocked him in week 4 and never once regretted it. The divorce took about 5 months to finalize. I kept the portion of savings I'd moved on day 1, and my lawyer told me that single decision likely saved me a significant chunk of money Jason would otherwise have found a way to quietly move around before the paperwork was even filed. There's a detail from the divorce proceedings I didn't expect either. Jason's lawyer tried to argue that moving the joint savings before the confrontation was somehow premeditated and unfair. My lawyer pointed out calmly on record that 8 months of a documented affair paid for partially with my own credit card was a slightly bigger problem for his case than a woman protecting herself financially once she found out. That was the last time anyone brought it up. 2 weeks after the divorce papers were filed, something happened that I still haven't fully told anyone outside my sister and my therapist, but I'm telling you now because it changes how you might see the ending of this story. Caitlin called me. Not Jason, Caitlin. I almost didn't pick up. And when I saw it ring out and go to voicemail, I almost deleted it without listening, but I didn't. The message was 4 minutes long, and for the first 2 minutes, it was exactly what you'd expect. Crying, apologizing, saying she never meant for it to go that far, that it just happened over time, that she never stopped caring about me as a friend, even while doing all of this to me. Then, in the last 2 minutes, the tone shifted into something I genuinely wasn't prepared for. She told me that Jason had approached her, not the other way around, almost a year before anything physical happened between them, that he'd been the one who kept escalating things, kept pushing, kept showing up in ways she said she should have shut down immediately and didn't. She wasn't trying to erase her own responsibility. She made that clear, but she wanted me to know I wasn't crazy for feeling like something had been wrong for far longer than 8 months. I don't tell you this to make Caitlin sympathetic. What she did doesn't get softer just because someone else also made a choice badly. But it did explain something that had been nagging at me since that first night on the bathroom floor. Why so many small warning signs had started so early, more than a year before I ever found a single message. It wasn't one mistake. It was a slow erosion that started long before I had any idea anything was wrong at all. I never called her back. I saved the voicemail anyway, for reasons I still can't fully explain to myself, and I haven't listened to it again since. Around that same time, I had to deal with something I honestly hadn't thought through at all when I first found those messages, which was work. Jason and I worked in different industries, so I never expected our split to touch my job in any way. But it turned out that Priya, the coworker I mentioned earlier, the one Jason had confided in a year before any of this became physical with Caitlin, worked at a company that shared a building with mine. We'd actually met once, briefly, at a joint holiday party 2 years earlier, and I'd liked her. In the small, forgettable way you like someone you talk to for 10 minutes at a party and never think about again. About a month after the divorce was filed, I ran into her in the lobby of our shared building, waiting for the same elevator. I almost turned around and pretended I hadn't seen her. Instead, something made me stay. She recognized me immediately, and her face did this complicated thing, somewhere between guilt and relief, like she'd been waiting a long time for this exact moment, without knowing when it would happen. She apologized, unprompted, for not telling me directly, for staying quiet instead of warning me the way some small part of her clearly wanted to. I told her I understood why she hadn't. It's a strange, uncomfortable position to be in, knowing something is wrong in someone else's marriage and having absolutely no good way to say it out loud without blowing up your own life in the process. I didn't forgive her exactly because there wasn't really anything to forgive, but I appreciated, more than I expected to, that she'd at least tried to talk Jason into being honest with me, even if he'd ignored her completely. It was a strange kind of relief to know that somewhere in that whole year, at least one person who knew the truth had tried to nudge things toward honesty instead of deeper into the lie. We still see each other occasionally in that lobby. We don't talk about any of it anymore. We just nod, sometimes say a quick hello, and go our separate ways, which honestly feels like exactly the right amount of closure for a relationship that was never really mine to begin with. I also want to talk about something that surprised me more than almost anything else in this whole process, which is how differently my friends split along old loyalty lines once everything came out. I'd expected everyone to obviously side with me. Instead, I learned that betrayal has a strange way of exposing which of your friendships were actually about you, and which ones were really about the couple you used to be, or about Jason specifically, in ways I'd never noticed while I was still married. Two women I'd known for almost as long as I'd known Caitlin quietly drifted away over the following months. Not dramatically, not with any kind of announcement, just slowly stopped responding to texts, stopped showing up to things, until I realized they'd made their choice without ever having the conversation with me directly. It stung more than I expected, honestly. Almost as much as losing Caitlin herself because I hadn't seen it coming at all. I'd assumed friendship groups didn't work like sides in a divorce. It turns out sometimes they do, whether anyone says it out loud or not. On the other hand, there were people I barely expected anything from who showed up in ways that genuinely changed how I think about friendship now. A woman from my book club, someone I'd only known for about a year at that point, drove 2 hours to sit with me the week the divorce was finalized, just so I wouldn't be alone in my apartment that night. She didn't say much. She just brought takeout, sat on my couch, and let me talk or not talk, whichever I needed in the moment. I think about that night more than almost anything else from that entire period, because it taught me something I didn't fully understand before all of this happened, which is that the people who show up quietly without being asked, without making it about themselves, are usually worth more than the ones who've known you the longest. It's been almost 2 years now since that Sunday dinner. I have a new apartment, a new job, and, more importantly than either of those things, new friends who I'm slowly, carefully learning to trust the way I used to trust Caitlin before I knew any better. Here's the strangest part of this whole story, and it's not the affair itself. Affairs happen. People are flawed. And I understand that better now than I did 2 years ago. The strangest part is how long I let myself not see something that, looking back, was honestly obvious for the better part of a year. It's amazing what your brain will quietly file away as probably nothing when the alternative is admitting your entire life is a lie. A few weeks ago, I ran into Amanda, Caitlin's sister, at the grocery store. She told me Caitlin moved to a different city and barely talks to anyone from our old friend group anymore. I didn't feel triumphant hearing that. I felt relief. The exact kind of relief you feel when you finally pull out a splinter you'd been carrying around for way too long. There's something about surviving a betrayal like this that nobody really prepares you for. And I want to share it before I get to the final part of this story, because it's the part I think about more than any single detail of the affair itself. For months after the divorce, I kept catching myself doing this strange mental math, replaying entire years of my marriage and reclassifying memories in real time. A trip we took to the coast 3 years earlier, one I used to think of as one of the happiest weeks of my life, suddenly had a question mark hanging over it. Once I realized the dates roughly overlapped with when Jason had started talking to that coworker, Priya, about how boring things had gotten. I couldn't tell anymore which memories were real and which ones I'd just been performing in without knowing it. My therapist told me this is incredibly common and that it even has research behind it. People who discover long-term betrayals often go through a kind of retroactive grief, mourning not just the relationship as it ends, but the entire history of the relationship. Because the story you thought you were living turns out to have been a different story the whole time, one you didn't get to read the real version of until the very end. It took almost a year of therapy before I could look back at photos from my wedding and feel something other than a small, sick drop in my stomach. I can look at them now. Not all of them yet, but most. A lot of people who heard this story the first time asked whether I ever forgave Caitlin, even a little, or whether we talk at all now. The answer is no, and I don't feel any pull to change that. I also want to say thank you to everyone who reached out with kind words after I first told this story publicly. Those messages are part of what finally pushed me to start therapy, something I'd been putting off for almost a year out of some misplaced sense that I should be handling it fine on my own. As for Mark, yes, people ask about that too because of how close we got during those first few brutal months. We're still close friends now. Not more than that, not yet, maybe not ever. And honestly, I'm in no rush to find out. For the first time in longer than I want to admit, I'm not building my life around someone else's timeline. I'm seeing someone new now, someone who knows this entire story from start to finish and who has never once questioned a single boundary I've set because of it. His name doesn't matter for this story, but I'll say this much. The first time I told him about the credit card charges, about finding out my own money paid for those hotel rooms, he didn't say anything for a long moment, and then he just asked what he could do to make sure I never had to feel that specific kind of unsafe again. That question alone told me more about him than months of dating ever could have. There's one more thing I want to add because so many people asked about it after the first time I shared pieces of this story. A little over a year after the divorce, Jason reached out one final time, not to apologize again, not to ask for anything, but to tell me he and Caitlin had briefly tried to make things work as an actual couple after both of their marriages ended, and that it had fallen apart within 4 months. He didn't need to tell me that. I think honestly, some part of him wanted me to know that whatever they'd broken 2 families for hadn't even turned into anything worth the wreckage. I read the message twice, felt absolutely nothing that resembled satisfaction, and blocked his number again, this time for good. I used to think closure was something someone else had to give you, an explanation, an apology that finally landed right, some perfect sentence that made all of it make sense. It isn't. Closure turned out to be something much quieter than that. It was waking up one random Tuesday about a year and a half after that Sunday dinner and realizing I hadn't thought about any of this in 11 days, then 20. Then I stopped counting entirely because I didn't need to anymore. If you've made it this far, thank you for staying with me through all of it. And if any part of this story sounded familiar to you, if you've ever caught yourself explaining away a detail that didn't quite add up, trust that feeling. I waited a year longer than I needed to. Don't make the same mistake I did. I want to add one last piece because I think it matters more than the ending itself. About 6 months ago, my sister asked me if I regretted waiting those 2 days before confronting Jason instead of screaming at him the second I found those messages. I told her no, and I meant it. Those 2 days weren't about hiding or being weak. They were the first 2 days in over a year where I was finally the one who knew something Jason didn't. For 8 months, he and Caitlin had walked around with a secret that shaped every single interaction I had with either of them. Every dinner, every phone call, every small kindness that I now understood was layered with guilt I couldn't see. Those 2 quiet days were mine. I used them to protect myself instead of falling apart in front of the 2 people who had spent 8 months making sure I never had a reason to suspect anything. I think that's the part I'd want anyone listening to this to hold on to. Not the affair itself, not even the confrontation at that dinner table, but the fact that somewhere in the middle of the worst week of my life, I still managed to make one clear-headed decision after another when every part of me wanted to fall apart instead. You don't have to feel strong to act like it. Sometimes the strength shows up afterward, once you look back and realize you already did the hard part while you were still convinced you were barely holding on. One more thing I want to mention, because a lot of people asked how I even found the strength to sit through that Sunday dinner without breaking down before I even got the phone out of my pocket. I practiced. That sounds almost silly to say out loud. But the 2 nights before that dinner, I sat alone in my car in a grocery store parking lot and said the words out loud to nobody, over and over, until I could get through the whole sentence without my voice cracking. I have something I want to show everyone. 9 words. It took me 2 nights to be able to say them without crying. I think people assume confrontations like that happen because someone finally works up the nerve in the heat of the moment, some sudden burst of courage that carries you through. Mine wasn't like that at all. It was closer to rehearsing for a performance I never wanted to give, knowing that if I stumbled, if my voice shook too much, Jason would use that shakiness as an opening to control the room the way he always had a talent for doing in any kind of conflict. I needed to be steady, not because I wasn't devastated, but because I knew steady was the only version of myself that wouldn't get talked over. Looking back, I think that parking lot rehearsal was the actual turning point of this entire story, more than the dinner itself. Because somewhere in those 2 nights of practicing 9 words until they stopped shaking, I stopped being the version of myself who spent a year explaining away a changed shower schedule and started being someone who could sit at a table full of people who loved the version of my life that used to exist and calmly show them it had never really been real. My sister still brings up that detail sometimes. the parking lot, the rehearsing, and she says it's the moment she realized I was going to be completely fine, eventually, even if it didn't feel that way yet. I didn't believe her at the time. I do now. I also want to mention the actual apartment hunting process because it turned into its own strange chapter of this story that nobody ever asks about, but that ended up mattering more to my recovery than almost anything else. For the first 2 months after I moved in with my sister, I couldn't bring myself to even open a rental listing app. Every apartment I looked at felt like admitting the life I'd built for 6 years was actually over. Not just paused, not just complicated, actually finished. My sister eventually sat me down and told me, gently, that living out of a guest room with half my clothes still in boxes wasn't healing. It was just a longer, quieter version of staying stuck. The first apartment I toured on my own, I cried in the parking lot afterward. Not because anything was wrong with the place, but because signing a lease with only my name on it felt like the most permanent, real acknowledgement yet that this wasn't a rough patch Jason and I would eventually talk through. It was simply my life now. Starting over from a one-bedroom apartment with a kitchen too small for the dinner parties I used to host every other month. I signed the lease anyway. I remember standing in the empty living room the day I got the keys before any furniture arrived, just standing there in the silence, and instead of feeling lonely the way I expected to, I felt something closer to relief. Nobody in that apartment was going to lie to me. Nobody was going to shower at a strange time or lay a phone face down on a counter that didn't exist yet. It was just mine, entirely mine, for the first time since I was 22 years old. I painted the bedroom a color Jason always said he hated, a deep, warm green he used to call depressing every single time I brought it up during our marriage. It was such a small, almost embarrassing thing to feel proud of. But I stood back after the second coat dried and felt genuinely fully happy for the first time in almost a year. Sometimes healing doesn't look like some big dramatic turning point. Sometimes it looks like a paint color you were never allowed to choose before, finally drying on a wall that belongs entirely to you. That's really the whole story. A marriage that looked perfect from the outside, a best friend I trusted completely, and a year of small, quiet warning signs I explained away one by one until I physically couldn't anymore. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone listening to this, it's that the version of yourself who ignores the tiny detail that doesn't add up, the changed shower schedule, the phone turned face down, the songs you don't recognize, that version of you already knows. She's just waiting for you to catch up. I still get messages, even now, from people who say some version of this exact story happened to them, sometimes with the details almost eerily similar: a shared calendar, a coworker who saw it coming before anyone else did, a friend who turned out to be someone else entirely underneath 11 years of memories. I don't think that means the world is full of people like Jason and Caitlin. Not really. I think it means betrayal. When it happens slowly enough, always leaves the same kind of fingerprints behind. The same small inconsistencies. The same explained away details. The same year of quiet before the one night everything finally becomes impossible to ignore. What I hope people take from this, more than the specifics of what Jason and Caitlin did, is permission to trust the version of themselves that notices things before they're ready to admit what those things mean. You don't need 800 messages and a screenshot of a shared calendar to already know something is wrong. Sometimes you just need to stop talking yourself out of what you already noticed months ago. Sitting quietly at the edge of a birthday party, wondering why your husband suddenly likes a song you've never heard him play before.